In May 1987, the peaceful town of Bryan, Texas was shattered by the sudden disappearance of a 9-year-old girl named Kandy Kirtland. What started as a routine walk home from school turned into every parent's worst nightmare. Hours later, her lifeless body was discovered in a wooded area, her hands bound, a single bullet to the head, and chilling signs of a brutal assault. But this wasn't the work of a random drifter or some unknown predator. The man responsible was hiding in plain sight, a local repairman named James Otto Earhart, a familiar face in the neighborhood. Quiet, odd, and forgotten. No one could have guessed the monster that lurked behind his dead-eyed stare. And what's more terrifying, Kandy's murder wasn't his only one. To understand how this soft-spoken loner became one of Texas's most cold-blooded child killers, and how death didn't silence the secrets he kept, we have to go back to the very beginning. But first, hit subscribe and tap the bell so you never miss a story that asks the question, what if the real danger was living right next door? James Otto Earhart was born on April 29, 1943, in Huntsville, Texas, a town best known for its sprawling prison complexes and long history with the Texas Department of Criminal Justice. Raised in a working-class family, Earhart's childhood was defined by simplicity, discipline, and a blue-collar ethic instilled by his father, Thomas Earhart, a skilled carpenter who earned an honest living with his hands. Despite the stable exterior, there were early signs that James was different: introverted, emotionally distant, and unable to connect meaningfully with peers or adults alike. He dropped out of school early, reportedly struggling both academically and socially, and never returned to complete his education. In 1968, at the age of 25, he married Linda Sue Shipper, and together they had a son, James Otto Earhart Jr., though the marriage would eventually collapse under the weight of instability, financial strain, and emotional distance. James drifted through a series of unremarkable and often short-lived jobs over the years. He worked as an appliance repairman, a salesman, and even tried his hand at junk dealing, often scavenging scrap metal and discarded electronics to make ends meet. He eventually settled in the modest community of Bryan, Texas, a town of southern charm and quiet streets, but even here, Earhart stood out. Neighbors described him as odd and socially awkward, a man who largely kept to himself, rarely smiled, and spoke with a flat effect that made people uncomfortable. Whispers began to swirl about his disturbing fascination with young girls, with some locals recalling unsettling encounters and gut feelings that something about him just wasn't right. Though he had no serious criminal record at the time, Earhart's reclusive nature and increasingly erratic behavior painted the portrait of a man teetering on the edge of something sinister. On May 12, 1987, in the sun-soaked streets of Bryan, Texas, a routine walk home from school turned into a nightmare that would haunt the town for decades. 9-year-old Kandy Kirtland, a bright, sweet-natured fourth grader, left Crockett Elementary School that afternoon like she always did, her backpack slung over her shoulders, her heart full of childhood innocence, and her only plan to get home in time to greet her mom. But as she walked that familiar path, something, or rather someone, interrupted her journey. Witnesses would later tell police they saw a man in a beige car pull up beside her, and watched as she spoke briefly to him through the window. Moments later she was gone. No screams. No struggle. Just silence and a growing, sickening fear that something terrible had happened. As night fell and Kandy failed to return home, panic gripped the community. Police and neighbors fanned out in every direction, searching ditches, sheds, alleyways, anywhere a lost little girl might be. But this was no accident. This was no case of a child who had simply wandered off. And by morning, that horrifying truth would become painfully clear. On May 13th, her lifeless body was discovered near a sand pit deep within a wooded area on the outskirts of town. She had been shot once in the head at close range, an execution. Her hands were bound with rough twine. Her clothes were in disarray. The innocence she carried was violently stolen by someone whose cruelty defied understanding. News of the discovery swept through Bryan like a wildfire of grief. A little girl was gone, not to illness, not to an accident, but to evil. And though the crime was unspeakable, the investigation was just beginning. What detectives would soon uncover would lead them to a man with a dark past, a strange demeanor, and a chilling obsession with young girls, a man who had blended into the very town he had poisoned with fear. As news of Kandy Kirtland's murder spread, the town of Bryan, Texas, plunged into a deep state of fear and mourning. Parents held their children closer. Schools implemented tighter security. And for investigators, the mission was clear: find the man who did this before he could do it again. The crime scene offered several disturbing clues. Kandy's body had been found with her hands bound by a very specific type of twine, rough, industrial, and not commonly sold in most local stores. The shot that ended her life came from a .22 caliber firearm, fired at close range, indicating that she was likely held captive before being executed. But even more chilling were the subtle signs that this was not a crime of opportunity. It was planned, deliberate, and carried out with terrifying precision. Investigators knew early on that they weren't looking for a reckless drifter or a mentally unstable transient. They were hunting a calculated predator, someone who had stalked his prey, earned her trust, just long enough to destroy her. Police began retracing Candy's last known movements and canvassed the area around Crockett Elementary. That's when a few witnesses, mostly children, recalled something strange. A beige or light-colored car had been spotted circling the area in the days leading up to the murder. Some remembered seeing it near school grounds, others parked near wooded areas. When descriptions were compared, one name emerged with unsettling consistency: James Otto Earhart. Earhart wasn't a stranger to the Bryan Police Department. He had previous arrests, burglary, trespassing, and suspicious behavior around young girls, though nothing that ever stuck long enough to keep him locked up. His reclusive lifestyle had kept him largely off the radar, but his name had come up in other unsolved cases involving women attacked in their homes and reports of young girls feeling watched or followed in nearby neighborhoods. Authorities brought Earhart in for questioning, and what followed was one of the most tense interrogations the Bryan Police Department had ever conducted. At first he denied any involvement. He said he didn't know Candi. Claimed he had been out near the lake on the day she disappeared, fishing, alone, with no one to verify his story. But the lies began to unravel when police executed a search warrant on his vehicle and property. Inside his car, officers discovered duct tape, twine, and a box of .22 caliber bullets, matching the caliber of the murder weapon. But the most damning find was the firearm itself, a .22 caliber pistol concealed beneath a tarp and toolbox, with forensic evidence later linking it directly to the bullet that killed Candi. Even more disturbing were the human hairs and fibers recovered from his trunk, hairs that would later match Kandy Kirtland's through forensic analysis. Faced with mounting evidence, Earhart eventually gave what police would describe as a partial confession, admitting that he had picked Candi up but insisting it was a mistake, that she had panicked and something went wrong. He claimed the gun fired accidentally. But the investigators weren't buying it, and neither would the court. The binding of her hands, the careful disposal of the body, and the attempt to sanitize the scene all pointed to premeditation, not panic. Earhart would later attempt to withdraw his confession, claiming he was coerced, sleep-deprived, and even hypnotized during questioning, an unusual and desperate defense that ultimately failed to hold up under scrutiny. The courts ruled that his confession was voluntary and admissible. By May 26, 1987, just 2 weeks after the murder, James Otto Earhart was formally arrested and charged with capital murder and kidnapping. The town breathed a sigh of relief, but justice was far from complete. As the legal system prepared to try him, another question loomed large in the background. Was this really his first victim? As investigators dug deeper into his history, a disturbing pattern of behavior began to emerge. A pattern that would eventually reach beyond Candy's case and reveal that Earhart had been hiding much more than anyone had realized. But for now, Bryan, Texas had its suspect. The man behind the monster had a name. And soon he would face the justice system for the life he so cruelly stole. When the trial of James Otto Earhart began in early 1988, the courtroom in Brazos County, Texas became the epicenter of both grief and outrage. On one side sat the family of Kandy Kirtland, a 9-year-old girl whose life had been brutally cut short. On the other side, a man who barely reacted to the charges against him, who sat stone-faced and distant as the prosecution laid bare the evidence that tied him to one of the most horrific child murders the region had ever seen. From the very beginning, the prosecution painted a clear picture. Earhart was a predator who had stalked Candi, lured her into his vehicle, restrained her, and ultimately executed her in cold blood. They presented an arsenal of forensic evidence. Ballistics linking the .22 caliber bullet to his pistol, twine identical to what was found on her wrists, tape with his fingerprints, and hairs recovered from the trunk of his car that matched Candy's. These were not coincidences. They were markers of guilt. Perhaps the most damning moment came when the jury was played portions of Earhart's own recorded confession. In a low, emotionless voice, he admitted to picking Candi up. He claimed it was unintentional, that she got scared, that he panicked. But the facts didn't support that version of events. The binding, the execution-style gunshot, the remote location of her body, all pointed to a pre-planned act of abduction and murder. Earhart's defense tried desperately to counter the avalanche of evidence. They argued that his confession had been coerced, that he was hypnotized, sleep-deprived, and manipulated into saying what the police wanted to hear. They claimed that without that confession, the rest of the evidence was circumstantial. But jurors weren't swayed. One by one, expert witnesses dismantled the defense's claims. A forensic psychologist testified that Earhart had shown no signs of coercion or psychological manipulation during interrogation. A ballistics expert confirmed the match between the bullet and Earhart's weapon. A forensic hair analyst stated that the odds of the hairs in his car matching Candi by chance were nearly non-existent. It took the jury less than 4 hours to reach a verdict. James Otto Earhart was found guilty of capital murder and first-degree kidnapping. When the verdict was read, Candi's mother sobbed quietly into her hands. There was no joy in the outcome, just a fragile sense of justice for a child whose life had been stolen far too soon. During the sentencing phase, prosecutors pushed for the death penalty, arguing that Earhart was not just dangerous, but incapable of rehabilitation. They highlighted his cold demeanor, his lack of remorse, and disturbing patterns in his past behavior, including previous incidents involving young girls, break-ins, and prowling behavior that painted the portrait of a man who had been teetering on the edge for years. The defense begged for mercy. They brought up his troubled childhood, his lack of a strong education, his failed marriage, and claimed he suffered from undiagnosed mental illness. But none of it could outweigh the horror of what he had done. On the final day of trial, the jury returned with their sentence. James Otto Earhart was to be executed by lethal injection. As he was led from the courtroom, still expressionless, still silent, there was no apology. No glance toward the family of his victim. Nothing. Just the cold, detached stare of a man who had destroyed a life, and showed no sign that he cared. Outside the courthouse, reporters gathered. A crowd formed, some shouting in anger, others in sorrow. One sign read simply, "Justice for Candi." But justice, many felt, had only just begun. Because behind Earhart's conviction lingered a darker possibility. If he was capable of killing a child so cruelly and so methodically, had he done it before? The answer, as the world would later learn, was yes. But it would take decades, science, and a grave being reopened to prove it. After being sentenced to death in 1988, James Otto Earhart was transferred to the notorious Polunsky Unit in Livingston, Texas, where Texas houses its male death row inmates. From there, he would eventually be moved to the Huntsville Unit, home to the state's execution chamber. It was here, behind thick concrete walls and iron bars, that Earhart would spend the next 11 years of his life, waiting. Life on death row in Texas is harsh by design. Inmates are confined to small cells for 22 to 23 hours a day, with limited human contact, no physical touch from loved ones, and no hope for parole. Earhart's cell, like the others, was stark and narrow, just enough space for a steel bed, a toilet, a sink, and his thoughts. For most prisoners, time becomes meaningless. The days blur together in a repetitive cycle of head counts, food trays, and distant screams from others awaiting the same fate. But for Earhart, those years were spent quietly. He rarely spoke to guards, seldom interacted with other inmates, and made few public statements. He neither confessed to the full extent of his crimes nor made any visible attempts at redemption. But that didn't mean he wasn't trying to escape death, not through violence but through the courts. Over the next decade, Earhart's legal team would file a series of appeals, challenging everything from the validity of his confession to the admissibility of forensic evidence, even raising questions about the constitutionality of the jury selection process. They argued that Earhart had been hypnotized during questioning, that his mental state was never fully evaluated, and that bias in the courtroom had skewed the outcome from the very beginning. Yet time and time again, courts rejected those arguments. In 1993, the U.S. Supreme Court declined to hear his case, effectively closing the door on further appeals. Texas, known for its swift and unyielding enforcement of capital punishment, pressed forward. As the execution date neared, Earhart became even more reclusive. He granted no interviews. He wrote no statements to the public. There were no claims of innocence, no pleas for mercy, no public apologies to the family of Kandy Kirtland. Just silence, cold and consistent like the man himself. For the Kirtland family, those years were agonizing. They had to live with the daily reminder that their daughter's killer was still breathing, still waking up every morning while Candi had been buried before she turned 10. Her mother once said, "It's not about revenge. It's about justice. My baby's gone and he gets to live? That's not justice." As August of 1999 approached, the date was set. The legal avenues had been exhausted. The appeals had run out. And after 11 years on death row, James Otto Earhart's time was up. But even in those final hours as he sat in his cell just feet from the execution chamber, he said nothing. No expression of remorse. No final letters. No public acknowledgement of the pain he caused. Just the same cold silence that followed him through trial, through prison, and now, toward death. The state prepared. The witnesses were notified. And the Huntsville unit readied itself for what would be the 184th execution in Texas since the state reinstated the death penalty in 1982. James Otto Earhart had spent over a decade behind bars. And now the last chapter of his life was about to be written, one needle and one final moment at a time. On the morning of August 11, 1999, the sun rose over Huntsville, Texas, casting long shadows across the high concrete walls of the Walls Unit, the oldest prison in the state and the site of Texas's death chamber. Inside, James Otto Earhart awoke to his final day alive. By now, Earhart had spent more than 4,000 days on death row, and though his execution had been scheduled for weeks, the weight of finality now sat heavy in the air. There were no dramatic last-minute appeals, no stays of execution, and no protests outside the prison walls. For many in the community, especially the family of Kandy Kirtland, this day was long overdue. As was customary, Earhart was offered the opportunity to request a last meal, one final moment of choice before the state carried out its sentence. His request was simple and unremarkable, almost mundane given the horror of his crimes. He asked for a cheeseburger, French fries, banana pudding, and iced tea. There was no extravagance. No feast. Just a plate of everyday food eaten in silence inside a stark holding cell just steps away from the execution chamber. Witnesses later said he showed no emotion, no anxiety, and no sign of spiritual reflection. It was as though he had already disconnected from the moment. That evening, just before 6 p.m., prison officials escorted him from his cell to the death chamber, a sterile room with pale green walls, a gurney in the center, and a viewing area separated by thick glass. He was strapped down by his wrists, ankles, and chest. Needles were inserted into his arms to deliver a lethal dose of chemicals: sodium thiopental to induce unconsciousness, pancuronium bromide to stop breathing, and potassium chloride to stop the heart. As required by protocol, he was given the opportunity to make a final statement. But Earhart declined. There were no last words. No message to the family of the little girl he murdered. No declaration of innocence or confession of guilt. Not a single word. Just the same cold, empty silence that had followed him for more than a decade. At exactly 6 p.m. the execution began. The chemicals flowed through his veins, and within minutes James Otto Earhart was pronounced dead at 6:20 p.m. For the family of Kandy Kirtland, it was a moment of grim closure. Her mother, watching from the witness room, said later, "I didn't expect peace. But I wanted him to know what he did. And now he can't hurt anyone else." Earhart left behind no letters, no explanations, and no public acknowledgement of guilt. The prison boxed up his few remaining possessions, letters, a Bible, and photographs, and his body was turned over to his family. But while the chapter on his life had ended, the story of his crimes was far from over. Because death would not be the end of James Otto Earhart's legacy. In fact, for one unsolved murder, his death would be the key to unlocking the truth. And it would take modern forensic science, and an exhumed body, to finally expose the full extent of what he had done. Nearly 2 decades before the murder of Kandy Kirtland, another brutal crime had shaken the Bryan, Texas community, a case that would remain unsolved for almost 40 years. On December 1, 1981, Virginia Freeman, a 40-year-old real estate agent, left her office to show a rural property to a potential buyer. She never returned. Hours later, her body was found on the lot, brutally beaten, stabbed, and strangled. Her car was still running nearby, and signs of a violent struggle were clear. The case left investigators baffled. There were no solid leads, and DNA testing at the time was in its infancy. For decades, the Freeman case grew cold, until new technology brought it back to life. In 2017, DNA evidence preserved from under Virginia's fingernails was retested using advanced genealogical DNA analysis. Through family tree mapping and forensic genealogy, analysts built a profile that pointed in a shocking direction: James Otto Earhart. But Earhart had already been dead for nearly 2 decades. To confirm the match, authorities obtained a court order to exhume his body. In 2018, DNA from his remains was taken and tested, and it was a perfect match. He was the killer. The brutal murder of Virginia Freeman, once an unsolved mystery, had finally been closed. Bryan police officially announced the case solved in 2019, stating that Earhart had met with Virginia under the pretense of buying land, then lured her to an isolated location and killed her in cold blood. With this revelation, a horrifying truth was confirmed. Kandy Kirtland was not Earhart's first victim. And it raised another haunting question. How many more were there? Do you think justice was served even if some of his victims never saw a courtroom conviction? What are your thoughts on exhuming criminals to close cold cases? Share your thoughts in the comments. Like, subscribe, and ring the bell for more chilling stories of justice served, and sometimes justice delayed.